Facebook and other social media sites are being criticized for not doing enough to stop bogus stories that seem to dominate the election cycle.
I mean, the big thing that happened was in the wake of the US presidential election in 2016 is we just were under a massive amount of scrutiny. That's a result of us making mistakes along the way, both in what we built and how we explain what we did, or maybe not explaining enough.
Facebook is now unveiling this new tool that will allow users to see if they at all interacted with a troll farm with ties to the Russian government.
It's a really difficult and painful thing, but I think the scrutiny fundamentally was a healthy thing.
You've created these platforms, and now they are being misused. And you have to be the ones to do something about it, or we will.
Fundamentally, Facebook is about trying to bring people together. We're trying to figure out what stories people are going to find interesting. We look at, do you like a story? Do you comment on a story? Do you share a story?
Nearly everything you see in your newsfeed, you're seeing because somebody who you're connected with or a page that you've decided to follow decided to share that. For a time, we felt our responsibility was mostly around just trying to help organize that information that you, in some sense, had asked to see. There was some reluctance to try to get in between you and those people.
One of the challenges in misinformation is that there is no one consensus or source for truth. If you think about all of the news that you read in a day, how much of it is objectively false? How much of it is objectively true?
The truth has this unfortunate aspect to it that sometimes it is not aligned with your desires. It is not aligned with what you have invested in, what you would like. And you can see that reflected inside of the content.
There's a lot of content in the gray area. Most of it probably exists in some space where people are presenting the facts as they see them.
People consider misinformation to involve a lot of different things. We've heard hate speech is misinformation, false news is misinformation, the speech about the government is misinformation. So one of the things we're doing internally is defining what we're really looking at and what we can measure reliably, and then figuring out how do we communicate that in a way that puts it in the right context.
We in journalism have a myth of objectivity. It doesn't exist. There's also an expectation of a myth of objectivity or neutrality in the platforms. It doesn't exist. Because Facebook is being manipulated, Facebook has an obligation to recognize that and compensate for that.
I think an extreme that would be bad would be if a group of Facebook employees reviewed everything that people tried to post and determined if the content of that post was true or false, and based on that determination, decided whether or not it could be on the platform. What I think would also be bad is if we took absolutely no responsibility whatsoever and allowed hate speech and violence to be broadly distributed. That wouldn't be taking nearly enough responsibility. The right answer is definitely somewhere in the middle, but that's a big middle.
We want to make sure that we don't inadvertently introduce bias. It's extra important in all of our work to kind of know your own biases, but also sort of take a step back and make sure you're listening to the other side.
This is a chart that I often draw for people about the world of false news. Imagine on the x-axis that you have the amount of truth in a piece of content. And on the y-axis, you have the intent to mislead. You can take this chart and you can split it into 4 quadrants, right? And the bottom left, you have the set of things that are low truth, but nobody was intending to mislead anything. That's just called being wrong on the internet, and it happens. And bottom right, it's the set of things that have high truth, but again, nobody was trying to mislead anyone. That's just called being right on the internet, and I'm sure it'll happen someday. But then we move up to the places where there's intent to mislead, right? And these 2 quadrants are the interesting ones. The top right, this is things that are high truth, high intent to mislead. So this is stuff like propaganda. This is stuff like cherry picking of statistics. Now, mind you, we have to be really careful here, right? Because of our commitment to free speech, everything we do here has to be incredibly, incredibly careful. But then we move to this quadrant. This is like the really dangerous quadrant, right? Low amount of truth, high intent to mislead. These are things that were explicitly designed and architected to be viral. These are the hoaxes of the world. These are things like Pizzagate. This is just false news. We have to get this right if we're going to regain people's trust.
Once we're able to define the tactic or the problem area, we're able to make more progress on it. And there's a lot of different types of misinformation. There's bad actors, there's bad behavior, and there's bad content. Bad actors are things like fake accounts or foreign agents. Bad behavior is using tactics like spamming to try to spread a message. And bad content includes things like false news, hate speech, or clickbait. We don't see just one of these things in isolation. They tend to kind of come in different combinations, but each of them requires a different strategy. And each of them also has different teams. And so one of the things we have to figure out is how do we work across this complex space to ensure that the teams who are fighting fake accounts, the teams who are fighting spam, and the teams that are fighting misinformation are coordinating and understand how best to leverage each other's technology and each other's understandings.
We have a series of steps that we can take, which we call remove, reduce, and inform. So the worst violations, the things that violate our community standards, those are simply removed. We also remove millions of fake accounts and bots that spread bad content. The next category is this gray area, things that don't violate a community standard, but maybe something people don't want to see, like clickbait or spam. In that case, we greatly reduce its distribution. A few people will still see it if this is something that your best friend shared on a topic that is greatly interesting to you. It might still be in your feed because we think you might still want to see it. And then the last step is inform. An example of this is that in some cases, we'll show you a related article that maybe gives you a little more context, or we'll give you more information about the source of the story. And that's just to help you make your own decisions. Is this a reputable source? Is this really giving you all sides of the story? The community is the best defense against misinformation in the long run. And so by informing the community, we can make that defense a little stronger.
One of the cases of ideologically motivated misinformation was a story of an undocumented immigrant who was living by a creek, sleeping under a bridge, and having a cooking fire to keep himself warm. But then it was picked up by one site that said that he was the cause of the Napa Valley wine country fires. So the misinformation took this story and twisted it.
In these situations, we work very closely with third-party fact-checking partners and rely on them to both surface content to us that might be misinformation, as well as help us verify things that are going viral on the platform.
If a certain source has multiple examples of false information, then that's a pretty good signal that things that they publish in the future have at least a higher likelihood of being false, and so maybe should be reduced in ranking.
Misinformation travels in a cluster with people spreading polarization, using exaggeration, sensationalism, low-quality content, running ad farms. So we combat a whole spectrum of problems. And one of the things that gives me hope in fighting misinformation is that we can come at the problem from so many angles.
When someone posts a misleading photo or video, it can be a lot more challenging. Because those are more visual, they're more visceral, it's harder for you to see it and then not believe that it's true. One famous example of this is the photo of the Seattle Seahawks supposedly burning an American flag in a locker room. They were celebrating after a victory. Someone photoshopped in a burning flag and then used that to make claims about these players disrespecting their country. We work with third-party experts who are trained in visual verification, and they're able to use a variety of tools, such as reverse image search tools that let them scrape the metadata from a public photo, and then use information in that metadata, like where the image was taken, and cross-reference that against the context in which the image is being used.
And it's not just happening here, it's happening in hundreds of countries for billions of people around the world.
Our teams are global teams, people that we're trying to hire thoughtfully, who bring different perspectives and different life experiences, and who do want to be accountable to the world.
In the early days of the net, there really was nothing that stood between us and each other. Now, of course, we hit abundance and overload, and thus you need algorithms and ranking to make sense out of it.
We have 2+ billion users here at Facebook. There are billions of pieces of content. We cannot individually categorize this as this or that as that. And so we have to do everything in the form of machine learning.
Machine learning algorithms are pieces of software that can essentially identify patterns. So you train the software by showing it examples of false content, and it can derive from that patterns that it can use to flag potentially incorrect content in the future.
Machine learning enables us to make predictions about a lot of data without having to have humans review each individual piece. So a machine learning model can predict how likely it is to use clickbait, or how likely something is to be sensational.
Because the problem is so complicated, we're deploying fundamentally every resource. We're leveraging machine learning everywhere we can. We're creating data sets that allow us to build algorithms that detect even the most nuanced version of misinformation. And we're figuring out ways how to leverage our network and our graph to understand how false information propagates so we can get ahead of it before it gets ahead of us.
Responsibility. With connecting people, particularly at our scale, comes an immense amount of responsibility. Every week we talk to all of you, all of the new hires, about all the work that we're doing to try and improve the integrity of the information that flows through a newsfeed, because it's important that you have that context. And we're going to have to work together if we're going to be able to effectively address the issues that we face.
We definitely think a lot about our responsibility. At the end of the day, we depend on our community of users, so ideally what's good for them is also good for us, and there's sort of a natural alignment of interests.
We try to make a more interesting newsfeed because we think that's good for people, we think that's good for communities, and that will also be good for us and our business in the long run.
Misinformation is going to remain a topic, but it's going to be an arms race. It's going to move from one frontier of the battle to a different frontier. But in the time that I've been here, we doubled in size in my team, and we're doubling again. So there's a great commitment to improving the integrity of our systems.
I think that we're making progress now, and that progress is going to accrue, and it's going to get better and better and better, and we're going to get interest on that progress. But we're taking great steps every single day towards solving this incredibly complex problem.
We have to get this right, not just for our platform, but for the community of people that we serve around the world.